Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. I'm here at the Renaissance Hotel in KL for the International Social Wellbeing Conference 2024, which is organized by EPF in conjunction with the Ministry of Finance, the Implementation Coordination Unit under the Prime Minister's Department, the International Social Security Association, and the ASEAN Social Security Association. And having said all that, I'm delighted to introduce my guest today, who's one of the speakers at the event, John Wilmoth, who is Director of the Population Division at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, which leads the monitoring of global demographic indicators. I'm delighted he's joined us today. Mr. Wilmoth, thank you so much for being here with me. I was hoping maybe you could begin our conversation just telling us a little bit about the Population Division under the UN. What exactly is its mandate? What is its role? For those who might not be familiar.
Well, we work in three areas. There's kind of data and analytical work that we do. We produce various reports on population trends, and we produce large data sets that are used by many other people in the world. For example, we produce the World Population Prospects, which is this collection of comprehensive population statistics for all countries and areas of the world. And we're working now on the next edition of that, which will come out next month. On 11th of July, World Population Day, we will release the new data. So that's one area, kind of the data and analytical work that we do. But we also support governments in their discussions around population trends and events and processes. And so, for example, there's something known as the Commission on Population and Development. It's part of the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And the Population Division supports the work of that body as it deliberates around issues concerning population change. And a third area of work is capacity building, where we support governments upon their request. We support them in developing capacities for understanding population trends, making population projections, and doing other sorts of analytical work that's relevant to population planning.
So let's take a look at the first part, the data part.
Yep.
We've crossed 8 billion people on the planet in November 2022, so a couple of years ago. That's 1 billion people added in the last 12 years alone. So talk to me about that. Where are the most significant areas of population growth occurring on the planet?
Well, today, the growth is increasingly concentrated in Africa and in the least developed countries. So I believe about half of the growth that's going to occur between now and 2050 is taking place in the least developed countries, you can say on the one hand, or in Africa on the other hand. So it's concentrated in the countries that are relatively poor with lower incomes, where various indicators of development are lagging behind. But where there is nevertheless progress and where there's hope for the future, but the challenge of rapid growth is still there. It's challenging for countries that must expand their school systems, for example, to accommodate an ever larger cohorts of children. And it's just challenging in various ways to constantly have to kind of build, and you're kind of running just to keep in place rather than running to get ahead, you know.
Okay, so how long do you think this trend is going to continue, this the growth that's happening in the African continent and less developed countries? Well,
in some parts of the world, the growth will continue throughout the current century. Even to the end of the century, we anticipate that it will not reach a peak. The populations of some countries will reach a peak and start to decline. Some of them have already done this. In China, it happened a couple of years ago that it reached a peak and started to decline. And many countries are in that situation, but there are some, mostly in Africa, that are still growing rapidly and will still be growing rapidly, not rapidly, but more slowly toward the end of the century.
So India has surpassed China as the most populous nation?
Correct. And that's because even though the fertility has fallen in both nations quite significantly, and the fertility level in India is now below what we consider the replacement level, which is just how many children does each generation need to have in order to replace itself, which is around 2.1 births per woman over a lifetime. India dropped below that level a couple of years ago, but China dropped below that level earlier and much more significantly. And as I cited in the talk just now, the total fertility rate in China is about 1.2 children per woman over a lifetime. So this is a very low level of fertility, and it's having a very noticeable effect on the population dynamics of the country.
So what impact does 8 billion people on one planet have on planetary health, on sustainable development? I'm just wondering, when we think about 8 billion people, and you talked about kind of some areas slowing, some areas growing, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it depends a little bit on your perspective. It's a good thing in the sense that, you know, what brought us here.
Right.
What brought us here was the increase of life expectancy that made it possible for more and more people to survive, especially children who used to, you know, there used to be like a 50-50 chance of surviving to adulthood in pre-industrial times. So we lowered the risk of dying among children so much over this time period. And you know, now it's very likely that children survive to adulthood and live a good long life. Death has become uncommon at younger ages. And that's what's driven the growth of the global population. So in that sense, it's a good thing. And this is a sign of our success as a species, that we've improved the quality of life for such a large percentage of the human population, that we're living longer, and that's what's brought the growth. But at the same time, of course, it's challenging because now we have to figure out how to live at this higher level of population, you know, as we move forward, how to avoid the problems that we're all aware of related to climate change and you know, planetary issues that, you know, there are no easy answers, but it's for those issues, if you look at it closely, is it driven more by the increase of population, or is it driven more by the change in people's consumption?
Right. So let's think it through, this dichotomy of overpopulation, of a growing population, of you know, the fact that we have so many people that will add to the planet's stresses, versus shrinking populations, declining fertility rate, birth rate, aging nations, countries that will no longer benefit from the demographic dividend. How do we think through that dichotomy?
Well, you know, I think the major challenge comes from the extremes. So very rapid growth or very rapid decline is going to be very challenging for countries, and probably they want to take steps to try and avoid that. But slow increase and slow decline is probably not a major problem in and of itself. Again, if it comes to something like climate change and the impact that we're having on the global environment, it has a lot more to do with how we live, how we consume, how much we consume in terms of energy and fossil fuel, burning of fossil fuels per person. That has changed more than the global population has
so
changed.
Population size, I would have assumed that population size would be the biggest and major driver of increased food production, of increased fuel consumption, of increased carbon emissions. Is that not accurate to say?
Food production, that's pretty much true, that it's driven largely by population growth, because people can only eat so much. You know, that you don't, even as you become richer, you don't necessarily eat that much more.
Well, some people can.
But when you become richer, you do tend to drive in your car more, and you tend to use, you know, have more gadgets and take more plane trips around the world and so forth. And so it's in those areas where we see that the individual consumption has risen so significantly, and really that's what's driving the change more than the increase of population numbers.
All right. So you're here in Malaysia to talk, to speak at the ISWC, where you just gave a talk titled the Global Aging Phenomenon, Navigating Demographic Shifts in the 21st Century. I'm so curious about what this means when you talk about a demographic shift. What would you say is the most pressing concern that policymakers should keep their eye on?
Well, again, I think it's the shifts are taking place. It's part of a process known as the demographic transition, where the death rates fall, life expectancy goes up, and then eventually the fertility rate comes down, and that brings things back into balance so that you don't have so much growth. But you know, it's the main concern, I think, is for countries that have found themselves in a rather extreme situation, those that are still growing very rapidly, or those that are facing a very rapid decline of their populations. You know, some of the fertility levels, in particular in East Asia, are very low. I mentioned China with 1.2 births per woman.
In your talk, you cited South Korea.
Yes, as about 0.9 children per woman over a lifetime.
One,
below 1
and below the
average.
replacement rate.
Well below the replacement rate, yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it means that the population will is heading toward a very rapid decline, and one that will be difficult to accommodate, in the sense that, you know, growing populations are younger populations. Declining populations are much older populations. So there's this, it's not just a question of the growth, it's a question of how the population is distributed across the age
intergenerational
range.
equity. So how do we think about a country going through that transition? I'm thinking about Malaysia. If we're thinking about Malaysia becoming an aging population and having to think about intergenerational equity, ensuring that we don't have a smaller working population taking care of a much older, a much bigger older population.
Well,
how do you think about that?
Well, that will be the case. I mean, you will have a larger and larger older population, and you know, you will have to find ways to provide for its needs. It's very important to build the structures, the government structures, the programs that will support the older population, because with a larger and larger one, it just becomes more and more important to have social protection systems in place, to have things like the Provident Fund, and to encourage savings, which the Prime Minister mentioned in his remarks, that there's tradition of savings in Malaysia that's very strong. And this is a very important part moving forward of how to, you know, to create a situation in which people can be supported at older ages, partly through government support, partly through family support, and partly through private savings.
Does it make it more complicated when there is inequality between generations? When you have an older population or older group of older generation that has accumulated a lot of wealth, and a younger working group that is maybe a lot poorer, or in terms of wealth and income, compared to the older generation?
Well, you know, eventually the younger generation will inherit that wealth as the older generation moves on. So it's maybe not as bad as you might think that way. But, you know, intergenerational equity is a complicated topic, because we know that things won't be equal across generations. I mean, life changes, medical science changes, and, you know, future generations will have access to many technologies and many advantages that previous generations didn't have. So how exactly to make that comparison is a little difficult.
Okay, well, I'm speaking to John Wilmoth, Director of the United Nations Population Division, one of the speakers here at the International Social Wellbeing Conference, which has the theme of aging and longevity towards a meaningful retirement. Mr. Wilmoth, I want to talk a little bit about how, so the second part of your mandate essentially is to support governments and to also build capacity. When you think about how to advise or support governments in creating population, evidence-based population policies, how do you think about that? What are the most successful policies that you've encountered? I want to ask you, say with the fertility rate, the declining fertility rate, how do governments go about addressing a declining fertility rate in the country? What would you say to the government of South Korea, for instance?
Well, I think, you know, the main thing is to support your population in having the families that they want. You know, we've seen in these populations with very low levels of fertility, when they take surveys of people, we've seen often that people report that they would like to have more children than they're having. Just like in very high fertility populations, if we take surveys and ask people, we often find that they're having more children than what they want. And in each case, it's because there's some imbalance in their lives. They may, in the high fertility populations, they may lack access to the means of fertility control. In very low fertility populations, there may be aspects of the way society is organized and the pressures on young people to succeed in their jobs and the difficulties of forming relationships in that situation. And there's often something related to the relationship between the sexes, especially I think in East Asia. This is a major issue that until the issues around gender equality are addressed, especially and including gender equality in the household, you know, in terms of who takes responsibility for household chores. Many women, young women, are rejecting family for various reasons, because they have careers that they want to pursue and because it just doesn't seem fair to them that then they go home from their job and then they have another job full-time at home and may not be receiving the support from their male partners.
Well, would incentives from the government help? I'm thinking of all these, you know, I guess, cash transfers or childcare incentives to encourage a population to have more children. Do those types of policies work?
There's mixed evidence on that. There's some evidence that they help, but that they're certainly not a reliable solution to this issue, because it tends to be that you can provide a baby bonus to people, like pay them $1,000 to have another child. And does that really increase the number of children that they'll have over the lifetime, or does it just encourage them to say, okay, today, let's go ahead and have that child that we were thinking about having in 5 years, but let's go ahead and do it now because we're going to get this $1,000, right? And does it really change their lifetime fertility? There's less evidence of that. But the programs that seem to make the most difference are those that really affect people's everyday lives and that support them in the challenging work of balancing employment and family. And so, for example, affordable childcare is very important because that's an everyday issue that all parents have to face for children of a certain age, obviously. And if the government can help people in that sense, it may have some positive impact on the birth rate. But it's not so simple as that. I don't think there's just one magic bullet that leads to higher fertility levels for populations that currently have very low levels. But there are some things that governments can try. But there are also some of these intangible things that governments might have trouble getting at. Like I say, these cultural aspects, these issues of gender equality. But governments can
try.
They can try. Yes. They have a soapbox. They can speak on these issues. They can push. But they can't change everything. It's partly in the culture of the people, and the change will have to come from below as well.
Right. So I also wanted to talk to you about another population trend that you look into, urbanization. Mm-hmm. And I find that quite fascinating. That currently 58% of the world's population lives in urban areas, and this is projected to increase to around 2/3 in the next 30 years.
Yeah.
That's remarkable, and that must speak a lot to the way we have to now think about city planning and urban planning and how we want our cities to look like if so many of us will be living in cities in the future. Right.
Well, it's easy to remember this statistic that in 1950 it was about one-third of the world's population that lived in cities. And in 2050 we anticipate that it'll be around 2/3. So over that space of 100 years it's gone from 1/3 urban to 2/3 urban. Of course, some countries have over 90% of their populations living in urban areas, and we may continue to see the move in that direction. But most of the urbanization that's taking place, kind of the increase of the urban population, will be happening mostly in Africa and Asia. That this is where there's really growth of the urban areas most significantly. And in that regard, I think it's very important to focus on how to build sustainable cities.
How do you view this trend? Is it I know this is quite simplistic to ask you, but is it a good thing or a bad thing that we are becoming more increasingly urban?
I think if we're going to have 8 billion people on this planet, and eventually maybe 10 billion, it's important to concentrate residential patterns in cities. It's the more that we're spread out, the more that we will have to consume energy to get from place to place. There are a lot of efficiencies by living closer together in cities. It's easier for governments to deliver services, and there are many efficiencies that come with living in more densely populated areas. So overall, I think cities are the way to go for most of the human population. As we move forward, I think most of the human population will want to live in cities, and it will certainly be the better thing for the planet as a whole if we continue that concentration.
And international migration is also part of the way this urbanization is happening, yes?
Well, it's true that cities are magnets for international migrants. I mean, that's often where international migrants settle, is in major cities around the world. And so, yes, it's connected.
Okay. So in the couple minutes that we have left, I do want to ask you what your concerns are if governments around the world do not pay attention to this, effectively manage either population growth or population decline, manage urbanization or migration. How do you tell governments to care about population trends?
Well, I'm not sure. How do we convince them to care about the trends? I think they care automatically. That has never been the problem, I don't think. Okay. I think the problem for us has often been that We want them to understand the changes that are taking place in the population and understand the implications of that for other areas of policy. For example, policies around consumption, fossil fuels. I mean, it's the urgency of doing something about the climate crisis is all the more intense because of population increase. Population increase didn't create the problem. It's part of the problem, but the major part is our increased consumption. So I think partly I want the governments to see these trends as kind of accelerating some of the other issues that we face and using that as an occasion to address those issues. But we have a concern in general that governments should not try to engineer their population trends because that means often intruding in people's lives in ways that are not so acceptable. For example, restricting access to fertility control methods, contraceptives, or trying to force women out of the labor force so that they go back into the home and have children. We're concerned about those sorts of moves by government to try and engineer population trends. That's not a good approach. The approach should be that governments seek to help people to have the families that they want. And that will, on its own, I believe, move us in a better direction, away from the extremes that we observe in different countries around the world.
Thank you so much for speaking with me. I appreciate it. That was John Wilmoth, Director of the United Nations Population Division, one of the speakers here at the International Social Wellbeing Conference 2024, has the theme Aging and Longevity Towards a Meaningful Retirement. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off for the evening. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.